I didn't mean to touch him like I did. How could I have known that moment would shift the ground beneath my feet? It had been such a normal day, quiet, predictable, until I opened that door, or rather until I saw that it was already half open. Something flickered inside me the moment I noticed it, like a signal I couldn't ignore. I could have turned away. I could have said nothing, walked back down the stairs, and made a cup of coffee like I originally intended. But I didn't. Because in that split second, I sensed that something was about to change, and it did. I won't pretend I wasn't the one who started things. I did. I didn't stop it either. George was at work. The house was still, almost too still. The only sounds were faint ones coming from upstairs. Elliot was in his room. I assumed he was on a call or maybe watching a video. He was always in his own world, especially lately. I thought, maybe I'd bring him a coffee. Maybe we'd chat a little. Break the silence. As I walked up the stairs, the quiet creaks beneath my feet seemed louder than usual. I paused near his door, trying to locate the source of the sounds. The door was cracked open, just enough to see through. I hesitated, hand half raised to knock, but then my eyes shifted. Elliot was sitting on his bed, laptop on his lap, the screen casting a bluish light across his face. His expression was focused, a little too intense. At first, I thought he was watching something thrilling, a car chase, a video game stream. But then I caught a glimpse of the screen's reflection in the mirror behind him, and everything inside me froze. I hadn't meant to see it. I hadn't even known what I was looking at until it was too late. The realization came like a cold wave, uninvited, unexpected. Elliot noticed me. He reacted instantly, scrambling to lower the screen, the panic on his face undeniable. His fingers scrambled over keys, trying to mute the sound, to make the situation disappear. But it was already too late. We had seen each other. There was no undoing that. When our eyes met, his face flushed deep red. He looked away, his voice shaking. I'm sorry," he stammered. I stood frozen. The door," I started, but the rest of the sentence never formed. My mind went blank. I couldn't even process what I was trying to say. I took a step back, heart thudding against my ribs, my hands pressed to my face as heat climbed up my neck. What had I just walked into? Why hadn't I knocked? Why had I stood there for even a moment too long? "Stop it, Darlene," I whispered to myself. I felt unsettled, not just from what I'd seen, but from how it made me feel. Conflicted, ashamed, confused. Elliot wasn't a child anymore, 23, a grown man. But I was 47. I had lived through my share of mistakes. I knew what shame felt like. And this, whatever this was rapidly becoming a memory I wouldn't be able to erase. I stood in the hallway trying to collect myself. My breathing was shallow and I could feel my scalp tingling. A minute passed, maybe two, before I heard the soft movement of Elliot approaching the door. He stood in the doorway, eyes down, adjusting the collar of his shirt. "Darlene, I'm sorry. I thought I'd closed the door." I nodded too quickly. "No, I should be the one apologizing. I should have knocked. I didn't mean to intrude." Silence followed. Heavy, awkward silence. We'd lived under the same roof for years, but that moment was the first time we had ever looked at each other with such discomfort, such raw vulnerability. I turned toward the stairs. "I should start preparing something for dinner," I said, my voice unsure. Elliot didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me walk away. We didn't speak for the rest of the day, not a single word. No eye contact, no texts, just silence. But it was the kind of silence that said everything, the kind that was louder than sound. Dinner was strained. We sat at the table like strangers, the clink of cutlery against china the only noise in the room. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, and he didn't try to meet my gaze either. The next day passed in much the same way, and the one after that. Everything appeared normal from the outside. Me washing dishes, him disappearing into his room, both of us pretending nothing had happened. But inside, there was a quiet shift, a tension building. Then, 3 days later, Elliot sat down beside me on the living room couch. My heart jumped. I wasn't sure what to expect. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and his eyes didn't quite meet mine. "Darlene," he began, voice low and nervous. "About the other day, I'm really embarrassed. I didn't want things to feel weird between us. I'm sorry. I just don't want to ruin anything." I took a deep breath. I needed to ease his discomfort, even though I was still wrestling with my own. "Elliot, believe me, I've had my fair share of embarrassing moments," I said, chuckling softly. "You'd be surprised." I told him a couple of those stories, ones that weren't too personal, but enough to make him laugh a little. He relaxed. His shoulders loosened. The tension between us seemed to dissolve, at least for those few moments. But beneath it all, something had shifted. I could feel it. He could too. "Guess we're even now," he said almost too quietly. I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" His expression changed. For a second, he looked like someone who had just said too much. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes darting away. "I've seen you the same way." The words came out barely above a whisper. I froze. "What?" I asked, though I had heard him clearly. His face was flushed, but he didn't backtrack. "You didn't know, obviously. I never told you. I didn't even mean for it to happen. But it did. And I haven't been able to forget about it." My pulse quickened. My thoughts scattered. He wasn't just confessing something awkward. He was breaking open a door we'd both kept firmly shut. I looked at him. He looked at me. Something had shifted again. From that moment on, everything changed. We had always had boundaries, unspoken ones, but solid. But now they were paper thin, invisible. We began spending more time together, watching movies, talking in the kitchen longer than necessary, sitting closer on the couch. None of it was overt, but the air between us was different, charged. One evening, while watching a film, our hands brushed. Neither of us moved away. We laughed at the same moment, our shoulders touching. It wasn't just casual interaction anymore. I could feel something beneath it. Still, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was all in my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in bed, restless. Thoughts spiraled through my mind. I was trying to convince myself that I needed to talk to him, to set things straight, to say something definitive. So I got up. The hallway was dim. Elliot's door was slightly ajar again, the light from his desk lamp bleeding into the hall. I hesitated. Inside, he was asleep. His laptop was closed, the screen dim. His breathing was slow, even. I stood in the doorway, unsure what I was doing there. I told myself I was checking on him, that he'd been drinking too much coffee lately and staying up too late. But the truth was, I didn't know why I was there. I just stood silently, watching the rise and fall of his chest, feeling the weight of everything that had passed between us. I turned away quietly and returned to my room, but sleep never came. The days that followed were quieter, but not calmer. I found myself thinking about Elliot more than I should have, wondering what he was thinking, wondering what I was feeling. Then it happened again. A moment, a conversation, a look. Each one inching us closer to something we hadn't defined. And I had a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't going away anytime soon. A few days had passed since that quiet revelation between Elliot and me. His confession, buried in half a whisper, still echoed in my thoughts. I tried to push it aside, to rationalize it as an impulsive statement, but I knew better. What he said wasn't accidental. It had come from somewhere deep, somewhere honest. And now, I couldn't stop revisiting it in my mind. I went about my days as usual. Laundry, errands, dinner preparation. But a strange awareness lingered in the background. Elliot and I were no longer just housemates. The dynamic had shifted. We moved around each other carefully, as though navigating an invisible line neither of us could name, but both of us could feel. One evening, I was folding towels in the living room when Elliot came in, holding 2 mugs of tea. He offered one to me without a word and sat down. We sipped in silence, the steam curling between us. "You okay?" he asked eventually, glancing sideways. I nodded. "Yeah, just tired." His eyes lingered on me for a moment. "You've seemed distant." I hesitated. "Maybe. I guess I'm just thinking a lot lately." "About me?" His voice was soft, but there was certainty behind the question. I didn't answer right away. "About everything." He nodded, accepting the vague response without pressing further. But the silence that followed was heavier than before. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was thoughtful, searching. We both seemed to be waiting for something neither of us wanted to say first. Later that night, I found myself in the kitchen alone, wiping down the counters. The house was quiet. George had called to say he'd be working late again, and I wasn't sure whether I felt relieved or disappointed. I looked out the window at the darkened street, the street lamps casting long shadows across the driveway. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, tired, thoughtful, a little lost. I didn't hear Elliot come in, but I felt his presence behind me. "You always clean when something's bothering you," he said gently. I smiled faintly. "Bad habit, I guess." He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Want to talk about it?" I turned to face him. "I'm not sure where to start." Elliot nodded. "That makes 2 of us." We stood there, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. There was nothing physical between us, no touch, no overt gesture. But the space was charged, alive with things unsaid. I could feel his eyes on me, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me feel seen, noticed. "I think we've both been walking around this thing," I said finally, "like it's not there, but it is." He took a slow breath. "I know. I don't know what it means, or what to do with it." He stepped forward just once. "Maybe we don't have to do anything yet. Maybe we can just be honest." I looked at him, really looked. "Okay." That was all we said. But it was enough. It was the first time we acknowledged what had been simmering beneath the surface. From then on, things didn't escalate. They deepened. Our conversations became more meaningful. We opened up about things we'd never talked about before. He told me about his struggles with school, with feeling like he hadn't found his direction. I told him about the years I'd spent trying to hold everything together: marriage, work, family, and how tired I felt sometimes. Not physically, but somewhere deeper. One night, we watched a film together on the couch. It was a quiet, slow-paced drama, the kind that left long silences and space for thought. As the end credits rolled, I realized I hadn't moved in over an hour. Neither had Elliot. "Do you think people always stay in love?" he asked suddenly. I turned toward him. I think some people grow in different directions, and sometimes love doesn't grow with them." "But you can still care about someone, even if the love changes?" "Yes," I said. "I think that's possible." He nodded, eyes still on the screen. "That's what I think about sometimes, with us." I didn't ask what he meant. I wasn't sure I wanted to know yet. But later that night, as I lay in bed, his words came back to me. With us. He hadn't defined it, hadn't put a label on what us meant. But it was there. A connection. Not romantic, not familial, not platonic, but something else. Something unspoken. The next few days passed in a blur. George was home more, and the atmosphere became more formal again. Elliot and I kept our distance in front of him, but when we were alone, it was different. It wasn't that we were hiding anything. There was simply a quiet understanding between us. One afternoon, while George was out in the backyard doing maintenance, Elliot and I found ourselves in the kitchen again. He was leaning against the counter, flipping through an old recipe book I hadn't touched in years. "Did you make all of these?" he asked. "Most of them. I used to enjoy cooking more." "Why'd you stop?" I shrugged. "Life got busy. And sometimes it's hard to cook for people who don't really notice. He closed the book gently. I notice. I looked at him. His expression was calm, sincere. Thanks, I said softly. He walked over to the fridge, pulled out a container of strawberries, and set them on the counter. Let's bake something, together. I smiled despite myself. You sure you can follow directions? Nope, but I'm willing to try. We spent the next hour laughing more than cooking. Flour dusted the counter, and we kept forgetting ingredients. But it didn't matter. It felt good, easy, close, like we were building something new, something neither of us could quite name, but both of us appreciated. As the dessert cooled on the rack, we sat at the table sipping tea. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? I asked quietly. Elliot considered that. Sometimes. I think we all pretend more than we admit, even to ourselves. I nodded. I've been pretending for a long time. He met my eyes. Maybe it's time to stop. That night, I wrote in my journal. Something I hadn't done in years. I didn't write about Elliot directly, not by name. But I wrote about change, about the spaces between people, about the weight of silence and the power of being seen, even when you're trying to hide. I didn't have answers. I wasn't ready to make any declarations, but I knew one thing. Something inside me had shifted, and whatever it was, it had a gravity I couldn't ignore. The days that followed were like walking a tightrope, balancing between what had been and what was forming. There were no dramatic confessions, no grand gestures. But there were glances. There were shared silences. There were moments when we both paused, like we were on the verge of saying something more. And then, one evening, after George had gone to bed early, Elliot knocked gently on my door. Just wanted to say goodnight, he said, leaning in the doorway. Good night, I replied, my voice soft. His eyes lingered on mine for a moment. You okay? I nodded. Yeah, just thinking. He smiled. Me too. Then he hesitated, turned slightly, and said, Thanks. For listening. For being who you are. I watched him walk down the hall, heard his door close behind him, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Anticipation. It had been over a week since that night at my bedroom door. Elliot's voice still lingered in my memory, gentle, soft, and sincere. Thanks for listening, for being who you are. It wasn't a grand statement, but it carried weight, the kind you don't shake off easily. Since then, our home had become a place of quiet glances and deliberate space. We spoke more often, yet never quite about the thing between us. We danced around it, avoided it. Not out of fear, perhaps, but out of caution, like two people aware of a fragile line they weren't sure they should cross. George had returned to his usual schedule, working late, attending meetings, sometimes sleeping in the spare room when exhaustion pulled him under. It wasn't unusual. We had long since drifted into a pattern of parallel lives. But now the distance between us felt more pronounced, and the gap wasn't just emotional, it was spatial. He was further from me than ever, and Elliot was closer than I'd expected. One evening, I was organizing the bookshelf in the living room when Elliot walked in. He sat cross-legged on the floor beside me and began helping without a word. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, sorting novels, old photo albums, and cookbooks I hadn't opened in years. This one looks ancient, he said, pulling out a sun-bleached hardcover. Probably is, I laughed. I think I bought that right after college. I was trying to make grown-up decisions about literature. Elliot smiled and flipped through the pages. You ever think about that version of yourself? Who you were then? I paused. Sometimes. She was more idealistic than I am now. She thought everything could be fixed with enough effort. Do you think she'd recognize you? It was a simple question, but it hit deeper than I expected. I looked at him and shook my head gently. I'm not sure, but I think she'd understand how I got here. He nodded. I think you're easier to see than you realize. I didn't know what to say to that. It was such an unexpected kindness, quiet, but deliberate. Elliot wasn't just noticing me, he was trying to understand me, and that scared me more than I was willing to admit. Later that night, I sat on the porch alone, wrapped in a shawl. The air was cool, the kind of chill that made you breathe a little slower. The stars were faint, but visible, scattered across the sky like pinholes in a curtain. Elliot joined me without asking. He brought 2 steaming mugs of tea and sat beside me on the bench. We didn't speak for a while. The silence between us had become a language of its own. "I like nights like this," he said after a long pause, "when everything feels quiet, but not empty." I nodded. There's something honest about it. No distractions, just being. He turned slightly, his shoulder brushing mine. "Do you think we're pretending?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "That we're just friends, roommates, that nothing's changed." The question hovered in the air like smoke. I exhaled slowly. "I think we're figuring it out." "Do you want to figure it out?" I looked at him, really looked. His expression was open but cautious, like he was afraid of the answer, but more afraid not to ask. "Yes," I said, barely louder than a whisper, "but carefully." He nodded, accepting that. Carefully is okay. We sat a while longer, sipping our tea, the porch light flickering slightly above us. It felt like a contract had been made, unspoken, but mutual. We wouldn't rush anything. But we weren't going to pretend anymore either. The next few days brought a strange kind of peace. We were still cautious, still careful, but there was less tension in the air, more clarity. We found a rhythm, cooking together, reading in the same room, talking late into the night about nothing and everything. One morning, I was in the kitchen, trying to whisk eggs while half awake. Elliot came in and leaned against the counter, watching me with a small smile. "You always cook like you're in a competition," he teased. "I like efficiency." He stepped closer. "Can I help?" "Only if you promise not to burn anything." "I make no promises." We moved around the kitchen like we'd been doing it for years. No awkwardness, no hesitation. It felt natural. And when our fingers touched reaching for the same spoon, neither of us pulled away. That afternoon, I found myself thinking about the past, about the years of quiet routine with George, the way our conversations had dulled into logistics. We had grown apart without ever arguing, and now I was beginning to understand that silence could be just as loud as conflict. Elliot, on the other hand, brought a different kind of silence, the kind that invited thought, not avoidance. He wasn't filling a void. He was creating something entirely new. That evening, I couldn't sleep. Again. I tossed and turned, restless. Thoughts churned in my head. I wasn't worried about what had been said. I was worried about what hadn't been. I got up and went to the hallway, intending to get a glass of water, but instead, I found myself standing in front of Elliot's door. It was closed this time, no light under the crack. I stood there for a moment, hand almost raised to knock, but I didn't. I turned away and went back to the kitchen instead. The next morning, Elliot was already up, sitting at the table with a book. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, not looking up. I hesitated. "Not really." "Me neither." We exchanged a look, brief but telling. We both knew we had hovered too close to a line the night before, even if nothing had happened. "Want to take a walk later?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I'd like that." We walked through the park that afternoon, the trees tinged with early signs of autumn. The breeze carried the scent of dried leaves and distant fireplace smoke. It was peaceful, calming. "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for something to happen?" he asked. "All the time?" "What are you waiting for?" I didn't answer right away. Maybe permission, to change, to move on. He nodded. "Me too." We sat on a bench beneath a tall oak tree, watching as children played in the distance and couples passed by hand in hand. It felt like we were in a different world, one where everything moved slower, where moments could stretch and mean something more. When we returned home, I felt lighter. Not because anything had been resolved, but because we had acknowledged the weight we were both carrying. That night, Elliot knocked on my door again. This time, he didn't linger. "Just wanted to say goodnight," he said. "Good night," I replied. He smiled and started to turn away, then paused. "I'm glad you're here." I watched him walk down the hall, the sound of his footsteps soft against the wood. And for once, I didn't feel conflicted. I felt understood. Autumn settled in slowly. The trees along the street turned gold and crimson, and the air carried that familiar crispness, like everything was preparing to turn inward. I found myself doing the same. The days between Elliot and me had become soft, quieter in a way that felt less like avoidance and more like understanding. We didn't need to explain everything anymore. Some things had been said. Others didn't need to be. George, ever preoccupied with work and his routines, didn't notice much. He was still present in the house, yes, but his presence had faded into background noise. And perhaps that was part of the problem. We had all grown accustomed to living side by side without really being seen. One evening, I was in the laundry room folding towels when Elliot appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, eyes watching me. "You know," he said, "I read something the other day. That sometimes people drift not because they fall out of love, but because they stop looking at each other." I paused. "That sounds true." He stepped inside, picking up a towel to help. "I don't want that. For myself. For anyone." For a moment, we just folded in silence. I've thought a lot about what we are.